Okay, now for something totally different. It's 10 after 4. As you might guess from my surname, my genetic cultural roots are Scandinavian. And they're peculiar types of creatures. I'm what's called an extroverted Norwegian. And the way that you can tell an extroverted Norwegian is I look at your shoes when I talk to you. So I start out talks like that because I like bad jokes, and the other thing is that jokes have a lot of similarity and resonance to these ideas that we've been talking about, in that they're very surprising, they're very nonlinear, and people usually respond in emotional ways to these kinds of changes that we're talking about. Okay, so moving right along here. So my background is as a wetland scientist, much like Jan's. I worked for government agencies in the United States. I'm a professor now. But what I really do is tell stories. I don't drink probably as much as I ought to, but I still try to tell stories. And so that's what I'm going to do here in a few minutes, and try and make these big or complicated stories out of two areas that I've been lucky enough to work in. One's really flat in the southeastern part of the United States, a fairly famous ecosystem called the Everglades. The other one is not flat, and it's in southwestern U.S., the portions of the Colorado River that have formed the Grand Canyon for many, many years. Both complicated ecological systems around which, over hundreds of years, people have manipulated in more or less different ways. Sorry about that. And one of those ecological services, goods, however you want to describe it, social values around both of these systems are sets of values around a natural ecosystem or ecosystemic values, whether they're aesthetic, whether they're recreational, as shown by their protection and set aside as national parks. Both of these systems are really governed by the control of water. There are lots and lots of structures that have been built to try and regulate water and move it around in various ways. If you were to add up all of the levees and canals in South Florida that form this thing, it would be stretched from Miami to New York, so thousands of miles of canals and levees. In a relatively short period of time, less than 100 years, this system has gone from a human population of less than 20,000 to now 8 million. And a lot of that has been enabled by this complex water management systems. The human systems seem to be doing really well. They support sports teams, celebrities all want to move to Miami. The economics are doing really well because Miami is an international banking center. Probably has nothing to do with the fact that it's there or the natural attributes at all. So all of these developmental values are fine except for the ecosystemic ones, right? And there's lots and lots of issues associated with that. They range from the endangerment of species. I think there are 20 species on the federal list. There have been changes in how many birds nest in the Everglades, which is one of the primary reasons that Everglades National Park was established. There have been changes in water supply as water is divvied up among these various interests, including an agricultural entity at the top. And issues of water quality, right? So lots and lots of complicated issues that characterize both of these systems. So this idea of resilience, right? So one of the, I think the ideas that Buzz was trying to introduce some 40 years ago now is really this idea that ecosystems undergo a level of change that was not previously captured. So he came up with this new word, resilience. Right? And the idea with introducing a new word that we now call ecological resilience is to focus on dramatic systemic shifts, right? Not just changes that can be subject to external forces, external variation, and then it will come back to the way it is. But why do these ecosystems undergo dramatic transformations characterized by different sets of species and communities, different energy flows, and different sets of social values, right? Because all of these notions, whether you characterize them as ecosystem goods or services, are really attributable to various states or regimes of these ecosystems, right? Where people, the sawgrass marsh was part of the historic Everglades, historic in the sense that it's been around for 6,000 years, a mere blip in geologic time. Actually, people have been in Florida longer than the Everglades ecosystem. Even so, that historic configuration is one that has all of this national and international reputation, and is characterized by these sawgrass marshes. Well, about 20 years ago, scientists started noticing that all of a sudden these sawgrass marshes would flip into something dominated by cattails, typhoon. And this is a classic regime shift, right? There's a disturbance involved. In this case, it was droughts or fires or freezes, right? A short-term event. But there were underlying changes as well, which led to that transformation. And in this case, it was the addition of a minute amount of a soil nutrient, phosphorus. Really, really minor. In fact, it was so hard to tell what caused this flip that it took about 5 or 6 years, millions of dollars of research, and multi-million dollars of legal work to try and figure out what caused this regime shift. Right? So this is what I talk about in terms of ecological resilience is what is the capacity of this to absorb changes before it flips into this, and moreover, how the way in which we manage these systems with all these complicated plumbing systems make these more vulnerable to these kinds of transitions, right? Okay, so a lot of the restoration efforts around the Everglades, which probably started some 20-ish years ago, and formally crystallized about 10 or 12 years ago, are really an $8 billion bet by the U.S. government. Right? In the year 2000, the U.S. federal government passed a law which authorized $8 billion, with a B, U.S., I know that's not euros, but it's U.S., still a lot of money, right, to restore this. That is, undo those kinds of unwanted ecological changes. And I call it a bet because we're not sure, really, about whether or not we can get it back. There was lots and lots of network activity, human network activity, that were associated with this transformation of articulating these problems, bringing to bear the best scientific knowledge, integrating that knowledge, trying to communicate that knowledge to stakeholders, to policymakers, that really went into this process before this law was passed. What else was I going to say? Well, one little bit of trivia here to talk about this kind of idiosyncrasies of this sort of social part of these systems. I thought this plan was dead on arrival. After 8 years of work putting together the plan that would restore the Everglades, the agencies presented it to Congress, and I said, well, their reaction was going to be, very nice, good work, but we can't afford it. Who's going to spend that kind of money? Well, there were two things that I didn't know about in this process as to why I was told afterwards this bill got passed. One was, it happened to be a time in which the U.S. government actually had money, thank you, not like now, But the other thing is that, imagine this, both political parties in the U.S. thought that Florida might play a key role in the 2000 election. So they were willing, both parties, to invest in this environmental restoration project to hedge their bets against an upcoming election. Pretty smart fellers, as we would say in the South. Okay. Everglades restoration has proceeded. There's a big, complicated network of actors that include both federal agencies, state agencies, formal institutions, right? Including august members of the National Academy of Science that are advisory boards as to how this restoration should unfold. All right, kind of jump to the story so I can move on to the Grand Canyon. What's happened? There's been so much formality in terms of this network and how they have to set up their rules to operate with each other that nothing has been done. Okay? So 12 years later, how has Everglades restoration progressed? Well, the bottom line is it hasn't. They haven't even been able to come to agreement on some things to try. Because one of the things that came out of these concepts of ecological resilience were approaches to dealing with natural resources called adaptive management. Because it said explicitly up front, once these thresholds are crossed, once these regimes shift or something, we really don't understand enough how to make these transitions. So what you have to do is you have to probe, you have to try, you have to be willing to do some things that are going to fail, some things are going to work. And so you have to approach it in a much more organic way of not presuming that you know the answer and it's just a matter of political will and resources to implement that policy afterwards. So even though Everglades Restoration is saying they're doing adaptive management, what they've been doing is a bunch of adaptive planning, which means that they're trying to get the plan right before they do anything. And if we have time later on, I really don't know why. I have some ideas, but it would be an interesting discussion. Okay, the other part of my talk, in the little bit I have here, is to talk about another system that has been able to negotiate or a lot of the pitfalls that have not that have happened in the Everglades, but they've been able to get around them. Similar water resource, lots and lots of resource issues, including what happens when you build a dam. Well, you trap all the sediments upstream, so downstream there's not as much mud and dirt moving, which is important to form beaches for people to camp on as they pay lots of money to go down this big scenic waterway. There's been a decline in population, another endangerment, some extirpation of fish species, all these things that were really adapted to living in a different kind of system. So in the Grand Canyon, the dam, the physical attribute of the dam caused a very dramatic ecological regime shift, where this river downstream from the dam flipped from being one that was muddy and clear. The word Colorado apparently translates to blushing, that it would turn red at times. Not that it would be red all the time, but it would turn red and clear. So it was a switching system. Water levels are stabilized, flows are stabilized, temperatures are stabilized, all of these sorts of things. And it has flipped to a clear, cold river now, right? So managers thinking about these things in ecological resilience terms really have two problems, right? One is you have a kind of regime that you want to keep. You like it, right? What the historic Everglades look like, what a river might look like, what a forest might look like. Or it's not where you want it to be, and so we have these large-scale kinds of restoration projects. And you have to acknowledge in these sorts of things hypotheticalities of reversibilities. Can you get back? Can you get back with through some different route, or hysteresis as it's referred to? And there are lots of other criteria. But I think one of the critical ones in all of these complex problems is being able to experiment because the paths are so complicated. I think that's the only way that we can figure them out. Okay. That's out of place. Sorry, I don't know why that slide came up. But anyway, that's what the experiments in the Grand Canyon are really about. Can you restore these lost attributes, right? And flip it back. Now, the Everglades problem, on the other hand, is really one of trying to stop that regime shift from ever happening, right? So lots of the policies about water releases from agricultural fields have been about you can't release that dirty water. Right? Okay, I think I got a few minutes here. So I wanted to introduce another idea here that probably a lot of you read about. I have this bad habit of making, my grandkids ask me what I do. And I said, well, really at the end of the day, it's a lot like what you do. In that I make stuff up. And this is some of the stuff that, in collaboration with Buzz, we made up. Right? One of the ideas in terms of that you all have mentioned today in struggling with these ideas of resilience theory is that it's a very scale-bound concept. Right? We can talk about resilience of what to what within specific scale regimes, whether that's a forest, whether that's a lake, whether that's a river or a wetland, those sorts of things. A coral reef. We can talk about alternate shifts at these different kinds of scales. Ecosystems are not, I would argue, not scale invariant. That is, they're not self-similar across these different scales, but different structures, processes, self-organization occurs across those scales. And so, so with this idea, this crap I made up, inventing a new word called panarchy really tries to deal with these fundamental disconnects between complexities of adaptive cycles that occur at different scales. We thought it was important to make a distinction, and hence the new word, because most of the hierarchy theory, and this was brought out by years and years of ecological investigation, talks about the role of the big, slow things constraining what goes on at smaller scales. Right? That's what hierarchy theory is about. The big and the large, the top of organizations, control, constrain. They figure out distribution of resources, distribution of energy, distribution of power. Well, the idea behind panarchy, and my brothers kid me that, well, it sounds a lot like anarchy, which would be appropriate for you, but it's really not, is to again highlight, much like Halling did with using the word resilience, these effects that lots and lots of ecologists have observed, and some of them talked about today, of how small-scale phenomena cascade to larger scale phenomena, whether it's forest pest outbreak, whether it's fires, whether it's disease. Local phenomena all of a sudden scale up. They cascade, they revolt. That is, the controls, the hierarchical controls that were placed on that are suddenly released so that these phenomena that were contained spread over spatial and temporal scales. The kind of auto-catalysis, right, that we heard about this morning. But the point with that is that, but it spreads to scales that become of interest. Right? The other key role in this model is the role of these larger scale systems at key stages in this adaptive cycle. And really that came about from some of these puzzles, like everyone has been asking out about. You know, how do they flip? How do they change? How do they exit here and become something else, right? Why is this dimension or axis of capital potential, why does it go back up during these reorganization phases? Some of those puzzles really led to this stuff of how at critical times are when these cross-scale linkages happen. Thank you. I will indulge. So this panarchy model helped explain and reveal some other dynamics as well. These are things that we call traps. This is my university right here, which is, as most universities, in what I call a rigidity trap, very stable, but at a cost. The Everglades is in the same kind of rigidity trap. Its inability to experiment is really, I think, an indication that the focus is on doing away with certain cross-scale linkages, right? So forbid any kind of experimentation, any kind of changes at small scales to filter up, to allow that novelty and diversity to go throughout the system, and to keep it going by lots and lots of resources coming in, right, from these larger scales. And what these require are these big, broad-scale ecological, social crises, right, to unlock the system. All right. I'm out of time, and I just wanted to briefly talk about, whereas in the Grand Canyon, they've been able to do a number of experiments that have allowed them to learn about the system. And let me kind of get to the end here about networks. So I and other authors talk about these governance networks that facilitate these more adaptive approaches that involve sort of really non-formal or different kinds of network members in the community, NGOs, stakeholders, outside of the realm of formal authorities who are charged with dealing with these sorts of things, that facilitate this sort of adaptive management approach as adaptive governance, right? Ron Bruner and other authors in the US talk about the same thing, but then they talk about it that way in much more using words like shadow networks and epistemic networks that really merge with these sort of formal institutions to create these more complicated kinds of management networks, if you will. There are a couple of places around the world where I think those are happening. One is the Glen Canyon program. Another one is the Great Barrier Reef rezoning, which recently went through a whole bunch of policy and legal changes in order to buffer against climate change. My bad attempt at diagrams of networks. One of the things I wanted to say here is that in terms of the kind of network complexity or institutional complexity, I don't think there's any difference between these two systems at all. I think that there, and in terms of the legal frameworks, in terms of the kinds of characteristics of the system, I think one of the big differences in this is the role of key leaders in these networks and their ability to be willing to take risks, to experiment along these lines. But I'm open to other suggestions, and I'm sorry that I run out of time here. But some of these ideas are very similar. They involve both formal and informal institutions, right? Epistemic groups, universities, think tanks, other stakeholders who are affected by these policies. These networks include both temporary and permanent members, right? They can create these kinds of arenas within which can challenge boundaries and relationships and provide that context. And I think that's it. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.